Okay, so this is a brief lecture about Eric Fromm's stuff on both narcissism and boredom. And Eric Fromm he's part of the Frankfurt School of kind of psychotherapy. He was an actual student of Freud, and he's a neo-Marxist. And these are very short, but this first one is dovetailing off of the McLuhan reading on Narcissus and Narcosis. And Fromm's kind of coming at narcissism from the psychological point of view, and you could think, again, this identity implicative Facebook sort of stuff, or even like the influencers. I think is a fairly new phenomena, which is a sort of see me, I matter. So here I'm going to read this. Fromm says this. He says, a narcissistic person considers only those things real and important that directly affect him. My ideas, my body, my possessions, my opinion, my feelings, all those things are real. And what is not mine is pale stuff that hardly exists at all. In pathological cases, narcissism can be so extreme that an individual is incapable of even perceiving what is going on in the outside world. And, I think we don't have to look very far to see extraordinary narcissism at work. I was like reading some of the blogs about the local paper, these Facebook sites where people can comment, and the kind of goofy ways, the sort of preening and showboating regarding ideas is, I mean, it's on some level it's pathetic, on another level it's kind of humorous, and then kind of like on a third or societal level it's very disturbing. And so I'll kind of close with this, in this time of pandemic, and it's this idea of, like, how narcissistic does one have to be to second guess um, the kind of scientific physicians of, say, the CDC or something like that. I mean, it's amazing that, people who have, know very little about biology, certainly have never been to medical school, feel very comfortable about pronouncing what is appropriate or not appropriate regarding this pandemic. So the test question, what does a narcissist consider as real? Um, the answer is only those things that directly affect him or her. All right, and then this next reading, it's a pretty lengthy reading. It's about boredom, and boredom is super interesting on the phenomenological level, or this idea of, as a phenomena, what are we as creatures that we can become bored? We're very boredable. And I guess I mean, I've done some reading into the subject, and actually some of my research is kind of focused on boredom, particularly this philosopher named Viktor Frankl. But the idea is, in the thick of life, in our kind of playful spontaneity, we're not bored. I mean, what is the opposite of boredom? It would be joy, and kind of a joy that stems from vivacity or life in action. So I'm gonna just read this. It's a lengthy quote. Maybe I'll pause. uh, Fromm asserts that boredom is one of the worst forms of torture. Right. It is a very modern phenomenon, and it is spreading rapidly. And I mean, that's very interesting that, like you can trace boredom as a term in the language, and how often it was used in literature, and really, like, boredom is more of a 19th century phenomena, I guess. When you're really struggling to live your life, and you're not bored. It's just only with satiety or fullness that you can get bored. If you were hungry or something, you wouldn't be bored. You'd be looking for food, right? You'd be hunting. If boredom in a way is a lack because of excess. It's fascinating. All right. A person who's at the mercy of his boredom and unable to defend himself against it will feel severely depressed, right? And this idea of defending oneself against one's boredom. right? If you can't do that, you're going to be depressed. And then it raises the interesting question of how does one defend oneself against boredom? And then Fromm continues. He says, "You may feel moved to ask here why most people don't notice how grave a malady boredom is, right? A malady is like an illness, and how much suffering it causes, right? Because we don't really think in terms of boredom as being such a horrifying thing. Uh, but he thinks it is." Fromm continues, he says, "I think the answer is quite simple. As we produce today so many things that people can take to help them cope with their boredom. We can temporarily sweep our boredom under the rug by taking a tranquilizer or drinking or going to one cocktail party after another or fighting our wives or turning to our media for amusement or devoting ourselves to sexual activity, right?" And then he continues, he says, "Much of what we do is an attempt to keep ourselves from fully acknowledging our boredom. But don't forget that uneasy feeling that often overcomes you when you watched a stupid movie or repressed your boredom some other way. Remember the hangover that hits you when you realize that what you did for diversion actually bored you to death, and that you haven't made use of your time but have killed it." Yeah, that's a great metaphor. Another remarkable thing about our culture is that we will go to any lengths to save time, but once we have it, we kill it because we can't think of anything better to do with it. Um, all right, so these are the test questions, and Fromm asserts that boredom is one of the worst forms of torture. That's what he says. So, and that first blank is torture, right? Historically, when did boredom come into being? Uh, Very recently. It's a modern phenomenon. I mean, think about that. That in our surplus, that's where the possibility of boredom can emerge. And you could go further into boredom. I don't know how long I want to make this, but this idea that boredom is a neglect of the present, it's a sort of manifestation of the sin of sloth, because the bored person is too lazy to kind of emerge out of his skulky, absent tepidness, right? Boredom is kind of what, there's a sort of lukewarmness, I guess, to boredom. Uh, and then what is from, so then he says, why don't people recognize their boredom? And, he asserts because there's so many gadgets, and, we have so many uh, forms of equipment that prevents us from sort of recognizing the futility. That's a very interesting argument. It's not, kind that's the assertion of the sort of psychological subconscious and whatever you want to make of it. It's like, I mean, often we don't really realize how bored we are. It's a kind of backstage thing. There's something interesting about like conscience, and there's a metaphysics about it too. Um, and then last, what does Fromm argue about saving time? Well, I mean, that's also a very interesting assertion to make, that, when we have time, we don't know what the heck to do with our time. So we waste our time doing stuff like getting drunk and kind of falling into what Heidegger might call das Man, which is just like the one. We do what everybody else does. So maybe we'll watch some stupid show, or kind of lay on our couch and watch sports and eat crappy food or something like that. But, just to summarize, that is like Fromm's analysis about boredom. And I want you to look out for the McGilchrist video, because he talks about boredom too. So it's not the last we're gonna deal with the subject of boredom.